It is great when two people in love have a common hobby. It brightens up the daily grind, helps cope with adversity, and is generally a source of joy. Of course, it's one thing when a couple is into reading or playing tennis, and another if they are fond of mountaineering. In extreme sports, shared excitement can lead not only to the conquering of new peaks, but to rash and risky actions, occasionally with irreversible consequences. In 1998, a tragic love story unfolded on Everest. The love of two people for each other, as well as their irresistible and dangerous passion for the mountains. About 35,000 people visit the area around Everest in Nepal each year, and that number continues to grow. Of course, not all of these people aspire to conquer the peak. Many simply wish to admire the Himalayan nature at the foot of the mountain or stay at the base camp at a low altitude. Annually, about 1,000 of the most courageous visitors try to reach the summit. More and more environmentalists call for a strict cap on the number of hikers on Everest. The mountain is littered with garbage that climbers leave behind: oxygen tanks, equipment, clothes, and tents. Then there are all the people who are not nearly trained enough, but are ready to risk their lives for the sake of conquering the legendary peak. Sadly, their bodies also litter the slopes of Everest. In the 90s, private companies began to earn huge money in mountain tourism, promising an ascent to the summit to everyone who wished. It was then that the traffic at Everest increased notably. This is where our story takes place, in the 90s on Everest, teeming with climbers. In the spring of 1998, the climbing season began, and the base camp was crowded with people harboring a burning desire to conquer the great mountain. Hundreds of people looked up at the peak every day, dreaming about how soon they would be there, and then satisfied and proud how they would call their relatives by satellite phone and recount their marvelous and challenging journey. Among these dreamers were Francys and Sergei Arsentiev, a couple bound not only by marriage, but also by a love of mountains. They even met in the mountains, at a camp at the foot of Mount Chou. Sergei was from Russia and Francys was from the United States. Sergei's group invited Francys to join them on a trek to Annapurna, and she agreed. So began a passionate romance which eventually turned into a happy relationship. Francys Arsentiev was born Francis Yarbrough in Hawaii on January 18, 1958. She had a son Paul from her first marriage to Joe DeStefano, but in spite of having a child, the couple didn't get along well and soon separated. The mountains beckoned Francys since early childhood. When she was 6, her father John took her on her first hike to the Colorado mountains. She attended the American School in Switzerland and then graduated from the University of Louisville. Francys planned to get involved in business and spend some time working as an accountant at a prestigious ski resort before going into real estate. Early on, Francys built up a reputation as a talented and accomplished climber. After conquering such world-famous peaks as Annapurna, she became the first US woman to ski down Elbrus, Europe's tallest mountain, and soon became well-known in mountaineering circles. Each year, Francys added more and more peaks to her impressive climbing record. Nonetheless, she was not a professional mountaineer. She had a job and did not aspire to be a full-time climber. In 1991, Francys was working as a real estate agent in Colorado when an ambitious Russian climber, Sergei Arsentiev, burst into her quiet life. Before going to the United States to his new American wife, his third, Sergei was an important figure at the St. Petersburg Mountaineering Club, where he was known by the nickname Mafia. Another participant of the climbing competition, a thin, broad-shouldered guy with huge arms, is nearing the fateful overhang and from the same position as all the previous competitors, calmly, without visible effort, suddenly takes hold of the seemingly inaccessible ledge and pulling himself up, gets to the top of the balcony. An amazed voice cuts through the silence. "Look at those shovel hands." A second voice adds proudly, "The Mafia has long arms." The fans who had been dozing off perk up. Someone shouts, "Run, Mafia!" In the 80s and early 90s, Sergei was considered to be one of the best climbers in the USSR. Francys, however, was also an experienced athlete. She joined Sergei's group of friends who respected her and believed she was a worthy wife for him. Sergei Arsentiev was born on September 10, 1958. After graduating from high school in 1975, he studied radio engineering in Leningrad. It was then that he went to the mountains for the first time and fell in love forever. In 1987, Sergei received the most prestigious Soviet mountaineering award, the Snow Leopard, for which you had to climb the 5 tallest peaks in the USSR. Sergei often climbed without the aid of bottled oxygen, a sign of excellent endurance and physical fitness. Sergei Arsentiev's first marriage to a biologist fell apart in the 80s, after which his ex-wife died of illness. The second marriage also ended tragically. Sergei's wife was fatally hit by a car after seeing him off to another mountain hike. Sergei's third marriage was to Francys Arsentiev. He moved to the United States and became a US citizen, as if trying to escape the evil fate that haunted his private life and the women that he loved. One night in the spring of 1998, little Paul, Francys's son, who usually supported all of his mother's mountaineering endeavors, awoke from a nightmare. In it, 2 people were stranded on a mountain, lost amidst endless snow and ice. Paul called his mom and recounted his frightening dream. At the time, Francys was already planning her trip to Everest. "I have to do it," Francys told her son, reminding him that he himself had wanted her to climb Everest before. Otherwise, he said, she would later regret not doing it. In the morning, Francys was to travel with her husband Sergei to the foot of Everest. That night, it seemed to her that Paul simply didn't want to let her go on the trip, as is often the case with children who are very attached to their parents. After allaying her son's fears and promising that she would be back soon, Francys got on a plane and began her journey to Nepal. However, Paul's dream turned out to be prophetic. From Moshnikov's press release Everest 98, March 1998. On March 20th, a group of mountaineers will set off from St. Petersburg via Moscow and on to Kathmandu. In Moscow, Anatoly Moshnikov will be joined by 3 US citizens, Sergei Arsentiev, his wife Frances DeStefano, and Fred Barth, as well as Roman Gilles, a climber from France. This team will be part of the expedition of Boris Sedusa from Perm. The expedition intends to reach the summit of Chomolungma, following the classical route from the East Rungbuk Glacier through the North Saddle. Anatoly, Sergei, and Francis hope to make the ascent without bottled oxygen. Francis and Sergei were not the only couple at the Everest base camp in those days. For many years, Ian Woodall and Kathy O'Dowd had been raising money to climb Everest and were now finally on the way to the peak. They had seen the Arsentievs, but only briefly, having begun their climb somewhat earlier than Sergei and Francis. Everest was their lifelong dream. Their journey was hard and long, but they were progressing fairly quickly, and soon they had only 350 meters left to the summit. Just a couple of hundred yards, and they would be able to tell their children and grandchildren about the importance of following their dreams. They would become conquerors of the world, and most importantly, they would do it together. As they struggled across the ice and rocks, Ian and Kathy tried not to think about the tragic part of their trek. That season, many climbers never returned from the mountain, and their bodies were strewn across the slopes of Everest. At the summit, however, there is no place for thoughts of death, only for those of life and purpose. Occasionally, the mountain takes climbers for itself, but that is an inescapable part of the grand pursuit of the summit. People on Everest realize that when disaster strikes, it's every climber for themselves. 9 times out of 10, helping someone at such an altitude is impossible. Kathy and Ian walked on, trying not to look around and not to think about the motionless colored spots dotting the slope. Suddenly, one of the bodies that they were passing by moved slightly. At first, they thought that they were imagining things, but the body moved again. It was a woman, and she was still alive. My heart sank when I realized that this person in the purple and black suit was alive, but completely alone at 8.5 kilometers, just 350 meters from the summit, Ian Woodall recalled. Kathy and I immediately turned off the route and tried to do everything possible to save the dying woman. Thus ended our expedition, which we had been preparing for years, begging for money from sponsors. We did not immediately manage to get to her, although she lay close. Moving at such a height is the same as running underwater. The woman in the snow was wearing only the thermal undersuit. The rest of her clothes was scattered around her. It's a side effect of hypothermia. You start feeling hot and you want to take your clothes off, Ian continues. As Katie snuggled up to her, trying to warm up, I pulled the hair away from the woman's face. I'll never forget my shock when I realized whose life was in my hands. Lying on the slope was Francys Arsentiev, who along with her husband had planned to climb Everest along its north face, which is prone to avalanches and considered exceptionally unstable. Francys wanted to set a record and become the first American woman to summit the peak without the aid of bottled oxygen. No woman had ever done it before, and the men who had attempted it often stayed on Everest's icy slopes forever. Still, Francys was well prepared. She had climbed 8,000ers before, and at base camp, she often talked about her son back home. She had somewhere and someone to return to. The woman was completely exhausted and could not move on her own. Barely moving her lips, yet struggling to survive, she murmured, "Don't leave me." Woodall continues. We spent 2 hours dressing her. I was losing my concentration due to the bone-penetrating rattling that broke the ominous silence. I realized Kathy was about to freeze to her death herself. We had to get out of there as soon as possible. I tried to carry Francys, but it was of no use. My futile attempts to save her were putting Kathy at risk. Torn between helping Francys and putting Kathy out of danger, Ian finally chose the latter. Francys kept pleading, "Don't leave me," but Ian realized that if they stayed with Francys, they would never make it down themselves. It would be impossible for two people to carry a severely frostbitten woman across the numerous areas of steep ice that cover the slopes of Everest. Maybe if there were 20 of them, and they had the help of Sherpas and porters. Ian says, I felt crushed. Every person believes that when fate throws a challenge, they will have the inner strength to do what they have to do, but I didn't have the strength to save this woman's life. There was nothing we could do. Grief-stricken, we returned to the camp. Don't leave me, those were the last words of Francys Arsentiev. Once back at the camp, Ian and Kathy informed the others of their terrible discovery, but there was nothing they could do. That year, Kathy and Ian didn't make it to the summit, sacrificing the cherished descent for the chance to rescue Francys and turning back when they failed to do so. Francys did set a record, becoming the first woman to summit the peak without the aid of bottled oxygen, but she could not come down and bask in the glory of her achievement. But how did it happen that such an experienced athlete found herself in such a desperate situation? Let's rewind to the day that the Arsentievs spent in the last camp before the summit. On May 19, 1998, they went up to the camp at 8200. They had to spend the night there, and the next day they planned to assault the summit and then descend. Alas, fate was not on their side. The Arsentievs could not reach the summit. They started their assault and then turned back. The couple spent 2 nights at 8200, but they were not going to give up. However, humans can't stay at such an altitude for long. Even with extra oxygen, the body slowly begins withering away. Without additional oxygen, the process is greatly accelerated. One by one, organs begin to fail. Visual and auditory hallucinations set in. Moving one's legs and holding on to the safety ropes becomes harder and harder. Even breathing turns into a challenge. From Shabanov's briefing for the channel NTV given by phone at Everest Base Camp on May 20th, 1998. After staying the night at 8200, on May 20th, Sergei Arsentiev and his wife, the American Francys Arsentieva, who was climbing without bottled oxygen, went up. The pair did not take flashlights with them and were forced to turn back after reaching the rocks. Nevertheless, they planned to go out again on May 21st, staying the night at 8200. Anatoly Moshnikov and his French climbing partner Romain Gilles also planned to leave the 8200 mark on May 21st. Anatoly Moshnikov, a St. Petersburg climber and acquaintance of the Arsentievs who was in the same group with them, came down to their tent on the third day together with his clients, whom he had already successfully guided to the peak. He informed the Arsentievs that it was dangerous to remain at such an altitude and suggested that they go down together to the base camp. But they didn't need his warning and instead attempted another ascent the next day, after 3 nights without oxygen. On May 21st, around 1 p.m. Nepal time, Anatoly Moshnikov and Romain Gilles reached the summit of Everest. Our heartfelt congratulations. Sergei Arsentiev and Francys Di Stefano are spending the night at 8200, planning to make the climb on May 22nd. They're feeling excellent. Uzbek athlete Rustem Rajapov, who was descending from the summit, met Francys and Sergei as they were going up, and Francys often sat down to rest. Rajapov also tried to persuade them to go back, but they stubbornly continued their ascent. The Arsentievs reached the summit only closer to 7 p.m. Everest was radiant in the last rays of the orange sun. Francys had set a record, but they could not celebrate for long. It was time to head back. It is often said that the way back down from Everest is harder than the way up. Once you have reached the summit, your concentration drops, and it becomes much easier to slip or fall asleep and freeze to death while taking a short rest. You start running out of strength after using all your body's resources to conquer the summit. It became dark before they could reach the closest camp, meaning they had to spend the night without tents, sleeping bags, hot food, or bottled oxygen. Their friends began to worry when the couple didn't return to the camp at 8200. The next day, May 23rd, a group of Uzbek mountaineers who were going upwards met Sergei Arsentiev. He asked them if they had seen Francys by any chance. The climbers were dumbfounded. How did the two manage to lose sight of each other during a joint descent? They gave Sergei some tea and he returned to his tents at 8200. At 8500, the Uzbek climbers found Francys. She was almost unconscious. Mountain sickness and severe frostbite had taken their toll. Her eyes were motionless, pupils dilated and frozen in one position. Her fingers were white. The day before, Ian and Kathy had stopped beside her, but failed to get her down despite her desperate pleas. There were more of them after all, and they were stronger. They gave her oxygen at maximum flow, using up 3 cylinders, tried injections, massages. Nothing helped. Francys kept tearing off her mask, mumbling something incessantly. A little later, climbers from South Africa and several Sherpas joined the effort. Together, they carried Francys down about 100 meters. Some reports claim that the expedition tried to pay several Sherpas to help carry her down further, but all refused. She was already too far gone. Despite all the efforts to help her, at 11 a.m., Francys died in the arms of her rescuers. Sergei, after hearing over the radio what was happening to his wife, went out to meet the group that was trying to rescue her. "Is she still alive? Where is she?" he asked the members of the Uzbek team as he approached them. They responded with silence. For 4 days now, Sergei had been going between the summit and the camp. He himself was close to fainting. Anyone, even the best trained athlete, would feel terrible in such conditions, but he simply couldn't leave Francys behind. Walking up to his wife, Sergei unplugged the empty oxygen tank, removed the now useless mask from her face, and hid her hands under her down jacket. Some say Francys's heart stopped beating just as her beloved appeared beside her. Sergei Arsentiev buried his third wife on the icy slopes of Everest, but this time he joined his beloved. The next day, several climbers found a coil of Sergei's rope and an ice axe just under the spot where Francys lay. It remains a mystery whether Sergei simply slipped and fell or decided to take his life. What thoughts haunted his mind that night? Maybe looking at the world from its highest point, he suddenly realized that his place was next to Francys, left his equipment in the snow, and that was it. From a letter written by Sergei Kalmykov, a friend and climbing partner of Anatoly Moshnikov, to Liana Darenskaya, June 1998. You may know that his first wife died from illness. His second wife was killed in a car crash. He found his third wife, Francys, while trekking through the Himalayas. He became a US citizen and moved to the States. Perhaps he subconsciously wanted to escape his fate, to start a new life. But it seems that you can't escape your fate. He ruined his third marriage by his own hand. Do you think he had any place left for him on earth? Where would he go? To her parents and to her child from a previous marriage? The theory that he committed suicide makes sense to me. If you don't like it, feel free to brush it off as nonsense. At any rate, that's how I reconstruct the events. In Ratio, I realized that no one could have helped her. But human beings can't exist without at least a bit of ethics or morality. Francys and Sergei's tent remained in the camp till May 26th. Other climbers waited to see if Sergei would return, even though some of his equipment had been found abandoned. There was no question as to what happened to Francys, and her family had already been informed of her tragic demise. But there was still a chance that Sergei, a well-trained and strong athlete, could return. There was a glimmer of hope. Other climbers in the camp claimed he was in good physical condition and had overcome serious challenges in the mountains before. But this time, there was an important psychological aspect. Rescue work in such conditions requires a dozen experienced climbers, a large supply of oxygen, and special equipment. There was none of that. The Uzbek team is young and inexperienced, and besides, they were constrained by the tough task of conquering the summit. There isn't nearly enough oxygen at 8200. Everyone takes only the bare minimum of equipment with them: a Jomar ascender, a couple of carabiner clips, and a descender. Can somebody be blamed for what happened? I don't know. Up there, you perceive the world differently. And no matter what people say, every person knows for themselves what they did. And that will stay with them for the rest of their life. From Anatoly Moshnikov's answers to questions about the rescue operation. Ian Woodall, the man who along with his partner first saw Francys, was haunted by the memory for many years. Maybe if he had done things differently, she could have survived and returned to her son. Day after day, her desperate pleas haunted his dreams like mountain echoes. Not a day went by that I didn't think about Francys. A year later, in 1999, Katie and I decided to try again to get to the top. We succeeded, but on the way back, we were horrified to notice the body of Francys. She lay exactly as we had left her, perfectly preserved in the low temperature. Kathy and I promised we would return to Everest to lay Francys to rest. It took a full 8 years and all of Ian's personal savings to prepare for the mission. In March 2007, Woodall and his guide reached Francys, who had by that time become known as the Sleeping Beauty of Everest and was used as a landmark to guide groups going to the summit. That year, Ian Woodall also planned to bury the famous Green Boots, but was unable to do so. Green Boots was later moved away from the main trail by a Chinese team. I wrapped Francys in a US flag and enclosed a note from her son, Woodall recalls. We pushed her body down the cliff, away from the eyes of other climbers. Now she rests in peace. Finally, I was able to do something for her. By the way, Ian Woodall led a South African expedition to Everest in 1996, the year which saw the most famous mountaineering disaster at the peak. Check out my video about that story. In his book about the 1996 Everest disaster, John Krakauer described Woodall as a conman who didn't care about human life. However, in the story of Francys, we see a completely different person. It makes one wonder whether Krakauer's evaluations are at all accurate or objective, given the way he also characterized the Russian climber Anatoly Bukreyev. You can find out more about that in another video of mine. I leave the link in the description. Sergei Arsentiev's body was likely found in 1999 near the peak, not far from where his wife had died. He was identified using pictures of the gear he took with him in 1998. From a response by Jake Norton, member of the Mallory Irvine 1999 research expedition. I apologize for the delay with the photographs of Sergei. It was definitely him that we saw. I remember the purple down suit. He was in a kind of bowed position, lying just behind Jokin's ill-defined crest of the rip in the Mallory area at about 27,150 feet. I think it's him. Let me know if you need anything else. I also have a picture of his wife, which I took after she was unhooked. Russell said her family wanted to have some photo of her body detached from the anchored ropes. Thus, the couple whose love story began in the mountains found their eternal rest at the highest place on Earth. There is no point in wondering whether Sergei followed Francys's fate voluntarily or not. They lived and died as the fate which once had brought them together at Cho-O-Yuo commanded. However, this story does make one think. Perhaps if Sergei and Francys were not that intent on going after summits and world records, they would have preserved what matters the most, their lives. Here's how Timofeyev, an acquaintance of Sergei, spoke of the couple's aspirations. We lived next to Francys and Sergei at the base camp and were listed on the same climbing permit. We went to the summit earlier and were on our way back to Kathmandu. At the pass, I managed to get in touch with Sergei. They had already spent 3 days at 8200. I tried to persuade him to give up the climb, but he insisted that they were feeling fine. From my point of view, of course, that assessment was inadequate. Francys was extremely motivated, both financially and morally, but had very little experience in high-altitude climbing. All this led to such a sad end, alas. All those years until Ian removed Francys's body from the slope, her son Paul was haunted by pictures of his mother taken by hikers from all over the world. In them, it seemed that Francys was asleep, as if she had merely stopped for a brief respite. Her skin was snow-white, making her look like a porcelain doll. Tragically, quite a few mountaineers meet such an end. Beneath the beauty of the mountains and the pride of personal achievement, there always lurks the danger of death. Is it worth it? That is a question every person has to answer for themselves. If you like this video, subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos. And as always, stay safe.